destined for greatness.
I found the crown of France in the gutter and placed it atop my own head.
How did a young Corsican outsider, born without wealth or noble title, rise from obscurity to become Emperor of France and nearly master of Europe within a single decade? Was it unmatched intellect, ruthless ambition, or something far more calculated? Napoleon Bonaparte didn't just fight battles. He rewrote the rules of power. From battlefield deception to psychological warfare, from lightning-fast troop movements to political manipulation, he built an empire not just with armies, but with strategy. In this video, we'll uncover the secret tactics he used to divide coalitions, mislead enemies, inspire loyalty, and leave monarchs trembling across Europe. These weren't just victories. They were blueprints for domination. This is how Napoleon conquered Europe, and why his playbook is still studied by generals today. The psychological game: control the mind before the battlefield. Before Napoleon fired a single shot or maneuvered a battalion, he had already started winning by conquering the minds of both his enemies and his men. He understood that morale, myth, and perception were just as powerful as muskets and cannons. Napoleon's charisma was legendary. He wasn't a towering figure physically, but his presence was commanding. He addressed his troops directly, often using you and we to create unity. He once declared, "A soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon," highlighting how symbols like medals, banners, and honor could ignite fierce loyalty. His soldiers didn't just fight for France, they fought for Napoleon himself. But he didn't rely on charm alone. Napoleon was a master of image. He carefully cultivated a heroic persona through paintings, engravings, and public bulletins. Even his infamous painting crossing the Alps, where he's seen on a wild stallion, was a calculated fiction. In reality, he crossed on a mule. But the image served its purpose: to build legend. He also manipulated news. Through the Moniteur Universel, the government newspaper, he framed defeats as strategic retreats and spun victories into epics. His bulletins were often exaggerated, but they stirred pride and confidence among the French and fear in his enemies. To his men, he was the revolution personified, proof that talent could triumph over birthright. To monarchs, he was a force they couldn't predict or control. Napoleon famously said, "Men are moved by two levers only: fear and self-interest." He used both with surgical precision. By the time he arrived on the battlefield, his opponents were often already demoralized, and his troops felt unstoppable. In Napoleon's empire, belief wasn't optional. It was the first weapon drawn. Divide and conquer Europe. Political disruption. Before invasion, Napoleon didn't just fight nations. He dismantled alliances. One of his most effective strategies was not military at first glance, but political. Divide your enemies, then conquer them. Rather than facing a unified front of European monarchies, Napoleon worked to fracture them before battles even began. He understood that the old powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, were riddled with centuries of mistrust. So instead of charging into battle with all of them at once, he exploited their rivalries and delayed their unity. He often struck temporary peace deals or alliances with one enemy to isolate another. For example, the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 aligned him with Tsar Alexander III of Russia, giving him a free hand to pressure Britain and Central Europe. This maneuvering allowed him to knock out Austria or Prussia individually instead of facing them together. At the same time, Napoleon redrew the map of Europe to create buffer zones and satellite states. In 1706, he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire and formed the Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of German states loyal to France. This not only protected France's eastern frontier, but also weakened Austria's influence in Central Europe. Similarly, he transformed parts of Italy into puppet kingdoms, placing his relatives on thrones in Naples, Spain, and the Netherlands. These weren't just political trophies. They were strategic tools to disrupt local loyalties and spread his administrative system. By constantly reshuffling borders and loyalties, Napoleon kept his enemies disorganized and reactive. While they scrambled to respond diplomatically, he advanced militarily. Napoleon understood that wars aren't just won on the battlefield. They're won in drawing rooms, over treaties, and behind closed doors. Before the first cannon ever fires, lightning warfare, le bataillon carré, and the power of mobility, Napoleon revolutionized warfare by doing something most generals feared. He abandoned mass and embraced mobility. His strategy wasn't about overwhelming numbers. It was about speed, coordination, and independent flexibility. At the heart of this revolution was the corps system. Instead of one massive centralized army, Napoleon divided his forces into self-sufficient units called corps. Each corps contained infantry, cavalry, artillery, and logistics, all the components necessary to fight independently for 24 to 48 hours. This meant that Napoleon could march large forces quickly while maintaining flexibility and initiative. This innovation gave him an enormous advantage. While enemy armies were slow to move, requiring weeks to assemble their full forces, Napoleon could move 70,000 to 100,000 troops across vast distances in days. His armies didn't just move, they flowed, like a network of rivers converging on a target. He also arranged his corps in a diamond or square-shaped pattern known as the bataillon carré, or square battalion. This allowed him to march in parallel across wide areas and rapidly concentrate on whichever front needed reinforcements. If one corps encountered the enemy, others could arrive quickly from nearby. One of the best examples of this strategy in action was the Ulm campaign of 1805. Facing a massive Austrian army under General Mack, Napoleon didn't engage in a full frontal assault. Instead, he outmaneuvered them. Using his corps to move faster and more flexibly than any force in Europe, he surrounded Ulm without a major battle. The result? Napoleon captured over 30,000 Austrian troops with barely firing a shot. It was a textbook display of mobility, coordination, and psychological pressure. Napoleon proved that speed kills, and that modern warfare favored the fast, not the large. His enemies couldn't catch him, outflank him, or react in time. By the time they figured out where he was already behind them. Misdirection and deception. Always leave them guessing. If there was one thing Napoleon loved more than winning, it was confusing his enemies. He believed that warfare wasn't just about firepower. It was about misdirection, timing, and psychological manipulation. One of his favorite tactics was strategic deception. He routinely used false reports, staged maneuvers, and dramatic feints to mislead his enemies. Troops would march in one direction, light hundreds of campfires, then stealthily march the opposite way at night. His enemies would arrive at a battlefield expecting one army and find another behind them. Napoleon believed that uncertainty crippled decision-making. If his enemies didn't know where he was or what he intended, they would hesitate, and that hesitation was often fatal. A masterclass in this strategy was the Battle of Austerlitz, 1805, often called his greatest victory. Facing a larger allied army of Russians and Austrians, Napoleon intentionally appeared weak. He thinned out his right flank and allowed the Allies to think they had found a vulnerable point. They took the bait, attacking aggressively, only to fall into a trap. Napoleon had placed his elite troops in reserve. As the Allies overextended, he launched a counterattack into the weakened center of their line, splitting their army in two. The result was devastating. Thousands of enemy troops were killed or captured, and the battle effectively ended the Third Coalition against France. It wasn't brute strength that won the day. It was illusion. Napoleon had manipulated the enemy's perception, setting the stage for their own downfall. His famous line captures the philosophy perfectly. In war, the moral is to the physical as 3 to 1. In other words, psychology, belief, and perception mattered more than raw numbers. By sowing confusion, hiding his true intentions, and mastering the art of misdirection, Napoleon turned warfare into a game of mental chess. And more often than not, he was always one move ahead. Control the narrative. Information warfare. Napoleon didn't just control armies, he controlled information. He was one of the first leaders in modern history to understand the power of media manipulation as a military tool. From the beginning of his campaigns, Napoleon ensured that the French public, and often even his own army, received a curated version of reality. He personally dictated military bulletins that glorified victories and downplayed setbacks. These bulletins were printed in the official newspaper, Le Moniteur Universel, and widely distributed throughout France. Every victory was described with heroic flair. Every retreat became a strategic repositioning. Even disasters, like the failed Egyptian campaign, were spun into tales of bravery and exotic adventure. He omitted defeats, inflated enemy casualties, and emphasized the righteousness of the French cause. This tactic wasn't about vanity. It was psychological warfare. By shaping the public's perception, Napoleon kept morale high at home and faith strong on the battlefield. His troops felt invincible, and the French people viewed him as a near mythical figure, both general and savior. But his information control went further. Napoleon cracked down on dissenting newspapers, censored letters, and even spread misinformation to confuse enemy governments. While traditional monarchies still relied on slow diplomatic channels, Napoleon created a feedback loop of image and influence, tightly weaving politics, military action, and public perception. One key moment was during the Egyptian campaign in 1798. Despite military failure and being stranded without naval support, he continued to send glowing reports back to France. By the time he returned, the public still saw him as a victorious conqueror of the East. Napoleon didn't just win battles, he crafted legends. In doing so, he proved that in the age of gunpowder, truth was just another battlefield. He understood that if he controlled the story, he could control the war. Civil and legal strategy, win the peace. After the war, Napoleon's brilliance didn't end with military victories. He knew that to truly hold a conquered region, he had to do more than defeat its army. He had to win its people. That's why one of his most powerful tools wasn't a cannon, but a legal code. In 1704, Napoleon introduced the Napoleonic Code, a standardized legal system that replaced the patchwork of feudal laws and customs across France and much of continental Europe. Where previous systems had favored nobility and inherited privilege, Napoleon's laws prioritized merit, property rights, and individual freedoms, at least in theory. The code abolished feudal privileges, guaranteed equality before the law for men, and streamlined civil administration. It protected property rights and centralized government authority. While it reinforced patriarchal norms and curtailed certain freedoms, like press and political opposition, it was revolutionary in scope and reach. Crucially, Napoleon didn't just impose the code on France, he exported it. Territories he conquered, from Italy to parts of Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, often adopted or adapted the code. Local elites, middle classes, and professionals often welcomed it. Compared to the chaos and corruption of old monarchies, Napoleon's system offered order, predictability, and social mobility. This made him more than just a conqueror. In the eyes of many civilians, he became a reformer, bringing modernity to places long ruled by stagnation. By aligning himself with Enlightenment ideals, Napoleon secured support from those who benefited from the new systems, often more so than from military occupation alone. Even after his fall, the Napoleonic Code survived and still forms the basis of legal systems in countries across Europe and Latin America today. In short, Napoleon understood what few others did. You don't just win by taking land, you win by reshaping it. Victory was meaningless unless it produced lasting structure, order, and loyalty. And through law, he conquered minds as surely as he had conquered territory. His fatal flaw, strategy gone too far. For years, Napoleon seemed invincible. He crushed coalitions, redrew borders, and set kings trembling. But like many great strategists, his greatest strength, relentless ambition, became his downfall. Two campaigns in particular revealed his limits. Spain and Russia. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain to install his brother Joseph as king. But what he didn't anticipate was the fierce national resistance. Spanish civilians, priests, and peasants rose up in a brutal guerrilla war. French troops trained for open battle were bogged down in ambushes and attrition. British forces under Wellington exploited the chaos, and Napoleon's Spanish ulcer drained men, morale, and money. But the most catastrophic decision came in 1812, when he marched into Russia with over 600,000 troops, the largest army Europe had ever seen. His goal: force Tsar Alexander I back into alliance. But instead of engaging directly, the Russians retreated, burned cities, and waited. Napoleon won battles like Borodino, but the Russians destroyed supplies and used the vastness of their homeland as a weapon. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, it was abandoned and on fire. He waited weeks for a surrender that never came. Then came winter. His army, exhausted, underfed, and freezing, began the long, disastrous retreat. Harassed by Russian cavalry and starvation, only around 100,000 made it back. These campaigns exposed Napoleon's fatal flaw. He could defeat armies, but not the will of entire nations. He underestimated asymmetric warfare, national identity, and geography. He was a master of grand battles, but not long grinding resistance. In Spain and Russia, his usual strategies failed. Supply lines overstretched, allies wavered, and Europe saw its chance. By 1814, the emperor who once redrew Europe's borders found himself exiled to Elba. Napoleon's brilliance changed history, but his hubris ended his empire. The mind that conquered Europe could not conquer its limits. So, what do you think? Was Napoleon a military genius or just the right man in the right chaos? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the mind behind the empire, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more historical stories and strategies from the world's most intriguing figures. Thanks for watching, and remember, in history and in war, the smartest move isn't always the loudest one.